right, everybody. Welcome back to the Mind Out Podcast. I'm Andy. Got a lot to get to in this episode. I've got some shout outs I want to get to first and foremost, and I want to introduce a new band that I really dig. I've been listening to one of their songs here recently, and they were kind enough to allow me to put it on the podcast, and I'll tell you about them in just a moment. But first, let's get to these shout outs. So I've got James Burnett. He works with the UN. Good to have you out there, James, on Twitter. He distributes food and first aid to refugees, so guys doing God's work out there, so we appreciate you, man. Bravo Kitty is a gamer from Parts Unknown. We've got Angie Ray, who's a writer and actor. She's also a self-proclaimed Panamanian princess, so she could be the real deal, we don't know. Anyway, she hails from Atlanta, so nice to have you out there, Angie. Hilton Arian Ruiz from New York. He's a director, so good to have you out there, Hilton. Last and certainly not least, we've got Dave Vesio, and I hope I pronounced your name right, man. I'm sorry if I didn't. He's a cult film icon out of Hollywood, Cali, so good to have you out there, Dave. Got a lot to get into today, but first, like I said, I want to introduce you to this band. They're called It Comes in Waves. You can check them out on iTunes. You can buy their music basically wherever you can buy music, from what I understand. You can check them out on YouTube. They had a new video that just dropped here recently. The song I'm going to use today is Danger, and I think this introduces the subject quite nicely, and even some of the lyrics coincide, which was kind of creepy if you ask me, but it's a good song. So we're going to get into it right now. Again, thanks for being out there. I appreciate everybody chiming in on Twitter and on the Facebook page. Again, you can always email us at mindoutpodcast@gmail.com. So this is episode 7. This is the BTK Serial Killer, and I'm going to introduce Carl Jung's archetype of the shadow in with this and kind of tie them together. So I've always got to put some kind of a psychological kind of twinge on things, so I hope you don't mind that. Later on, maybe it won't be quite so dense and so heavy, but I think this is worth talking about, so good to have you. Here we go. So, one of my listeners told me that I need to slow down a little bit at times because they felt like there was some jargon issues with the podcast, and I respect that, and I appreciate the feedback. So I was going to just go right off into the unconscious mind and just assume everybody knew what I was talking about. But the more I thought about it, I think I owe an explanation of what this is whenever I talk about it. Because I think most of us have an idea of what consciousness is and being unconscious, but it goes deeper than just how the current society sees what the two things are, just in common everyday vernacular. So the unconscious that I'm talking about in this episode, at least, is the place that in psychoanalytic theory, it's the place of repressed wishes and desires. It's the place where dreams come from when we're asleep. And it's not directly accessible to our awareness. That would be more like the pre-conscious, and I'm not going to dig into that, but there's different levels of awareness in the mind, and the unconscious is the one where the archetypes really are present, that we don't really have access to, that the myths and the stories of heroes and witches and all the things that you could think of, maybe that you could find in the plot of a movie, would be an unconscious archetypal theme. And the way that we have access to those are through the myths and the stories and the legends and all that. So it gives us an idea of what that is, but underneath those myths and those stories is it's a very deep, very, like I said, inaccessible place that we all have in our mind, that it's more of a state that primal man would have been in prior to our modern consciousness as what we know, our awareness, and our being able to think and plan ahead and make tools, and that's what really distinguishes us from the other primates, is our ability to plan and to be able to have a level of awareness that breaks us out of just instinct, that's driven straight from the unconscious mind. Carl Jung had talked about the collective unconscious and how, as a group, you can kind of be in communication without even knowing it, kind of like bees in a beehive just doing what they do, or other animals and the instincts that they have, that they're just operating off of, kind of like an automaton, I think they call it, just kind of like a drone, just kind of doing through instinct what it's supposed to through nature. That's kind of the realm that I'm talking about, and that's where our primal instincts reside. That's where, in all of us, where this shadow is, that I'm discussing in this podcast, that I'd mentioned dreams, fantasies reside in kind of our primal desires and our taboos and our things that we probably repress a lot of. And when we repress things, a lot of times we are unaware of that, but yet it drives the boat at times. We have, say we have something simple as like an addiction. Like, we know it's happening, but we've got no clue, like, who's manning the ship. It's just, we're just going along for the ride because these impulses that we have are stronger than we are, So a lot of times it takes years for people to be able to get on top of that and really become aware of just everything they're doing and what their impulses are and why they're there. And a lot of times people don't fully understand, but they do get control. But that's where a lot of that comes from in the fantasy life. And that's I'm placing quite a bit of emphasis on fantasy, at least in this episode, because this is really where, and we'll get into Dennis Rader here in just a bit, but this is really where he had a very rich fantasy life that was, I'm wanting to say, unencumbered by any kind of feelings of guilt or remorse, that it wasn't taboo for him. For him, it was just, this is just his mind and how it really kind of took over and subjected the man to these primal instincts that we all have, and the difference is, and that's what makes it so interesting, is someone like him or anyone else that goes beyond, like the societal norm as far as something like murder. Like what's the difference between the average person like myself or you? And, there's that line that gets crossed at some point where the rest of us would be like, whoa, I'm not going to do that because of XYZ. It's going to cause my family issues. I'm going to get locked up. I'm going to, feel guilty about it. I'm going to be, it's just not who I am. And I think that we all have to contend with that. And in this unconsciousness that we have, that really guides a lot of what we do, there's chaos there. And so we're constantly trying to bring about a higher sense of who we are, a more genuine purpose of what we're doing, a more orderly ideal of how we should live. And that's a direct result of identifying unconscious issues that are maybe going on and causing us problems, really self-reflecting and working on those things. You see a lot of people with, just everyday stuff. So it wasn't too long ago people were making New Year's resolutions, so like I've got to stop eating this and this, and I've got to work on this and this, just because I've let it go, and I don't care to look at myself in the mirror because I know there's an issue there that causes me problems. So we're constantly trying to burn off the dead wood and make ourselves into something that we want to be, and it's this orderliness that we're trying to fashion out of what we got, the raw material, that really promotes ideally a more kind of worthy self-image of what we would like to see, when we look in the mirror. Now, for someone that is really kind of controlled by the chaos, or maybe the shadow is inverted. I'd had a conversation with a colleague earlier in the week about how this gets flipped for people who can cross that line, and knowingly doing so. On one hand, it would be different if somebody was completely psychotic and not really understanding what they're doing. But on the other hand, there's the person that does it and is proud of it, or does it and knows that they don't have a consciousness that is going to contend with them in such a way that's going to cause them to be remorseful, or desire for them to need to change the behavior because it's going to cause them psychological problems. There's the cognitive dissonance that somebody could have when they're doing something that they know they shouldn't be doing, but they're doing it anyway, and so there's this constant conflict inside. That's what most of us have. And so that's that's what tells us, that inner voice like, whoa, slow down, don't do this, you're doing the wrong thing, and we have these people like myself who are our own worst critics, and are constantly trying to do better and get better and be better. And then on the flip side, you have people that, like Mr. Rader, they just don't care, And in his way, it's not that he didn't care, and I can't speak for him, but what I can say is he told me that he's very good at compartmentalizing things. And he calls it cubing. He says, I can be a family man, I can be a husband, I can be a worker, I can be a dad, and he calls it, cubing. I cube that stuff into one side, and he says it's very easy for him to be able to switch from the good cube to the bad cube. And he said I learned in a cube, and I could cube, which he means compartmentalize. I could cube very quickly and yet have all the human emotions a normal person has in the good cube. He says family, husbandry, dad, work, friends, etc. He said I was very sincere in that cube. So to unpack that a little bit, that's a lot right there, that you can have all the human emotions. And I think everybody's understanding of emotional awareness is a little bit different. If you don't think so, go talk to a teenage boy and find out just how much they understand their emotions. But that's what he says, is that he has all the human emotions that a normal person has. And he says that he was very sincere in that, but yet he's able to compartmentalize that and go into the bad cube and be the BTK strangler. And he's able to flip-flop between those. And I think we're looking at that from like years worth of addiction and years worth of being able to work on how he compartmentalizes things. I don't think that it was anything that it was just right off the bat that he was able to do that. But then again, that's speculation. I would really think that it would take some practice to be able to get that down right. Because he said, so in, like in the bad cube or the dark cube, he said, I had asked him, when did you first understand? And he called it Factor X. So this is the thing that makes him kill, that makes him want to have these desires and act out in a way that normal people wouldn't do. And I asked, prior to the acts of violence, did it evolve any, or did it evolve as you participated in more killings and more, more mayhem and more torture with people? And he told me that he knew something possessed him, and it had from around age 11. He said, so probably about the 5th or 6th grade. And he said it had evolved, but the roots of Factor X started entering his life. So it was something that was working its way, into these fantasies that he had, as something that maybe there was a potential of really being able to act out in a way that he really was desiring. He said, when it entered his life, he said he now knows what Factor X is, but he's also talking about, he didn't want to go into too much detail with me because he said that he's going to be maybe writing a book on it in the end of the year, into next year or so. and then maybe kind of share that book. So I'm wondering if he's got some kind of a publisher or writer on the outside that's helping him through that. But anyway, he said the beginnings of that started from a fish pond at his grandparents' farm when he was about age 11. And he said that there's a frog metaphor in here that he identifies with factor X as being this in a material form, this frog. So he calls the frog batter, and I have no idea why, but that's its name. And he said it's a metaphor and figure that came from a frog, and he called it it's a scapegoat for factor X. And then he goes on to call it a winged creature, or a frog that becomes a dragon. And I find that interesting because there's a lot of when I read through his writings, there's a lot of wording that is consistent with unconscious themes or archetypal themes of the shadow. And this guy don't even know what any of this is, but it's important to identify these things because it makes sense and it's spot on with some of the stuff that he's saying. So like there's an old archetypal theme of Ouroboros or Ouroboros, however you want to pronounce it. I've heard it both ways. And this is like the snake that eats itself, so you see a snake with its tail in its mouth making a circle. And that's the chaos of the potential of the unconscious, nature, Mother Nature even. There's a existing potential that things can grow from. And a lot of you have heard order out of chaos. And that's really what it's about with the shadow and the unconscious, is like having this mass of a potential and being able to change that into something that's useful with consciousness. So I know that's a little bit kind of really kind of an esoteric kind of view. But I don't want to get that deep. I don't want to get that far in. I just want to give kind of an idea of what this is. But let me get in to what he talks about, like this scapegoat, and he calls it a winged creature or a frog that becomes a dragon. And so this dragon of chaos, let's establish that. And talk about like some more of the unconscious and shadow type of language that he used. So you've got, this pond that he talks about, which beneath the surface is an unconscious theme, like underneath, because there's the depths and there's the abyss and you don't know what's down there. And so that's also an unconscious theme. Factor X is definitely an unconscious theme because he doesn't even know what it is. I mean, he's says that it was demonic possession, basically. But that also comes from a place of the unknown, and that's kind of like what a cult is. It's the unknown, or maybe unknown knowledge of who knows what. And so he goes on and he mentions, having this dark nightmare that he lived in, and learning how to cube, and separating the good cube from the bad cube. But I think I'm digressing a little bit. I don't want to go too much into the shadow and overshadow the kind of reason for the podcast. This episode in the podcast, which was talking about BTK anyway. I just wanted to be able to identify and help people understand, like, how does something like this take place, and what's going on in somebody's mind that can strangle and kill people to satisfy a sexual, basically a fetish that they've got, an addiction. But so let me start with what he says about some suggested reading that he has. So he wanted me to at least talk about 2 books that he would like people to know that that's legit information, that if they had any questions about him or his past, and there's a lot in there, probably more than I would ever come up with. There's a book by Dr. Catherine Ramsland, and this is one that he said he helped write. It's called Confession of a Serial Killer, The Untold Story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. And there's also another one called The Dark Mind, The Anatomy of Violence, The Biological Book of Crime by Adrian Rain. He said to check those 2 out, and you would have a better understanding of how people like him operate. He had himself studied serial killers along this timeline of before and I guess after he started killing. I think he wanted to learn from their mistakes and not get caught, and he did that for a long time until he slipped up and sent a floppy disk to the police department, and they actually found the stamp on the, I guess whenever each computer has a signature when you put a floppy disk in it, which we don't anymore, and it said where it was from, and it was from the church that he was the president of the congregation for, and it had the username of Dennis on it, so it was pretty easy to track down at that point. But anyway, he did know what podcasts were. We're talking about a guy in his mid-70s, and he was also excited that, well, I don't want to say excited. He just said that it was refreshing to do something different than a true crime show or true crime podcast. I think he's about, he said he's been around the block, so I guess he's basically answered all of those type of, questions that they had as far as like just crime and that kind of stuff. So, which I did have some questions about his crimes just to better understand things, but I also asked some questions about, like the first one was like, do you remember the first time you viewed your sexual urges as abnormal compared to others, and how old were you then? And that's when he told me, about being around 11 years old and noticing a difference. And he said that they became more sexually intense around the time of like 12 or 13. So that fantasy life really grew in him. And then he mentioned it was more like an addiction for him, because I asked him about rationalizing his behaviors and did he know what it might take as far as being violent to actually act this stuff out. And he said that it was more like an addiction that grew from the fantasies and then ended up being the real thing. And he said that there was violence in his early fantasies, and some of that turned into animal cruelty, and he said those were his first victims. So I think at this point it might be good to contextualize some of this. I'm going to read some of the writings that he had sent to the police department, to WKAK TV in Wichita, and to give people an idea of some of the mindset of Mr. Rader during the height of the beginnings, really, of his crimes. These letters take place within 4 years of the first initial crime. He writes a letter to the police department, but before then he writes to a newspaper, the Eagle Beacon, in 1974 about the Otero case, and that was his first case where he had murdered 4 people. And in this letter he writes, and some of the language is just how he speaks in the letters, so some of it seems a little bit maybe off the wall or incoherent at times, but anyway, here goes. So on the Otero case, he says, I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer as well as your time. Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself and with no one's help. There has been no talk either. Let's put this straight. Joe, position, southwest bedroom, feet tied to the bed, head pointed in a southern direction. Bondage, window blind cord. Garrote, blind cord, brown belt. Death, the old bag trick, and strangulation with clothesline rope. Clothed, white sweatshirt, green pants. Comments, he threw up at one time, had a rib injury from a wreck a few weeks before, laying on coat. Julie, position, laying on her back crosswise on the bed pointed in southern direction. Face cover with a pillow. Bondage, blind cord. Garrote, clothesline cord, tie and a clove hitch. Death, strangulation twice. Clothes, blue house coat, black slack, white sock. Comments, blood on face from too much pressure on the neck, bed unmade. Josephine, position, hanging by the neck in the northwest part of the basement. Dryer or freezer north of the body. Bondage, hand tie with blind cord, feet and lower knees, upper knees and waist with clothesline cord, all one length. Garrote, rough hemp rope, 1/4 inch diameter. Noose with 4 or 5 turns. Clothes, dark bra cut in the middle. Sock. Death, strangulation once. Hung. Comments, most of her clothes at the bottom of the stairs, green pants and panties. Her glasses in the southwest bedroom. Joseph, position, in the east bedroom, laying on his back, pointed in eastern direction. Bondage, blind cord. Garrote, 3 hoods, white t-shirt, white plastic bag, another t-shirt. Clothesline with clove hitch. Death, suffocation once. Strangulation, suffocation with the old bag trick. Clothes, brown pants, yellow-brown striped t-shirt. Comments, his radio is blaring. All victims had their hands tied behind their backs. Gags of pillowcase material. Slip knots on Joe and Joseph's neck to hold leg down, or was at one time. Purse contents south of the table. Spilled drink in the area also. Kids making lunches. Door shade and red chair in the living room. Otero's watch missing. I needed one, so I took it. Runs good. Thermostat turned down. Car was dirty inside. Out of gas. Over. I'm sorry this happened to society. They are the ones who suffer the most. It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversion hang-up. When this monster enter my brain, I will never know, but it here to stay. How does one cure himself? If you ask for help, that you have killed 4 people, they will laugh or hit the panic button and call the cops. I can't stop it, so the monster goes on, and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims, being torture and being mine. It a big complicated game, my friend, of the monster play, putting victims' number down, follow them, checking up on them, waiting in the dark, waiting, waiting. The pressure is great, and sometimes he run the game to his liking. Maybe you can stop him. I can't. He has already chosen his next victim or victims. I don't who they are yet. The next day after I read the paper, I will know, but it too late. Good luck hunting. Yours, truly guilty. P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their M.O., or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. You see, he added again. They will be on the next victim. He goes on after this and writes another letter, which actually holds a poem on a 3x5 index card to the Eagle newspaper. And the poem, and I'm not going to read through it, called Shirley Locks, and it's patterned after a Curly Locks nursery rhyme. But he goes on. You can find it online, I'm sure. He goes on later, after this, 2 years later, as a matter of fact, and KAKE TV receives a 2-page single-space letter from him claiming responsibility for both the VN and Fox murders. So these are other murders. And he's irritated, so he writes, I find the newspaper not writing about the poem on VN unamusing. A little paragraph would have enough. I know it not the news media fault. The police chief, he keep things quiet. How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? It's hard for me to control myself. When this monster enter my brain, I will never know. Maybe you will stop him. I can't. Do the cop think that all those deaths are not related? Yes, the MO is different in each, but look at the pattern that is developing. The victims are tie up. Most have been women. Phone cut. Bring some bondage matter. Sadist tendencies, no struggle. Outside the death spot, no witness except for the VN's kids. You guess the motive and the victims. After a thing like Fox, I come home, I go about life again like anyone else, and I will be like that until the urge hits me again. So speaking about the VN children who he had locked in a bathroom while he murdered their mother, they were very lucky. A phone call saved them. I was going to tape the boys and put plastic bag over their head like I did Joseph and Shirley, and then hang the girl. God, oh God, what a beautiful sexual relief this would have been. You don't understand these things because you're not under the influence of Factor X. The same thing that made Son of Sam, Jack the Ripper, Harvey Glatman, Boston Strangler, or Dr. H.H. Holmes, Pantyhose Strangler of Florida, Hillside Strangler, Ted of the West Coast, and many more infamous character kill. It seems senseless, but we cannot help it. There is no help, no cure, except death or being caught and put away. P.S. How about some name for me? It's time. 7 down, many more to go. I like the following. How about you? The BTK Strangler, Wichita Strangler, Poetic Strangler, the Bondage Strangler, or Psycho, the Wichita Hangman, the Wichita Executioner, the Garrote Phantom, the Asphyxiator. And with another poem about Nancy Fox, who was his 7th victim, he wrote again another poem. What is this that I can see, cold icy hands taking hold of me? For death has come, you all can see. Hell has opened its gate to trick me. O death, can you spare me over for another year? I'll stuff your jaws till you can't talk. I'll bind your legs till you can't walk. I'll tie your hands till you can't make a stand. And finally, I'll close your eyes so you can't see. I'll bring sexual death unto you for me. BTK. Now there were a lot more letters that he wrote. There were poems, there were cereal boxes he had sent in with clues to things that he had done, or drawings of depictions of crime scenes that the police hadn't let out to the public. At one point he had sent a driver's license from one of his victims in to prove that it was him that did the crime. And so next week we'll get into more of the questions and answers. There was just too much to cover on this one podcast to hold, to retain everybody's attention for that long. So I ran into more material than I thought that I was going to, but I thought that I wanted to, at least that I owed it to the audience to not rush through it and to go through each of the questions and answers, the responses that he had to some of the things that I asked him, and then also to compare some of the case notes from other people that had worked on the case or done research on the case. So thanks everyone for listening. Part 2 will be out in a week or two. Again, you can find us at Twitter at Mind Out Podcast. You can go to our Facebook page and check us out. You can email us again at mindoutpodcast@gmail.com. And at some point, like I keep saying, I know I'll get to it eventually, but we'll have a Q&A. I'm going to have a buddy come in and help me out with that episode. So it's been great doing this. Again, I appreciate everybody. So I hope you have a good week. Take care of yourselves out there. Till next time.